All right, good morning, guys. Welcome to day 2 of BSidesCharm. Hope everyone's having a great time so far. This was my first B-Sides, and really enjoyed it. Excited to go through this talk and keep enjoying all the other talks and events happening today. Very quick show of hands. My talk's on malware analysis, and I want to take 3 polls. Beginners, you haven't really looked into this field too much. You don't know too much about the tradecraft. Intermediate, you've dabbled, you've played, you're aware, but you wouldn't maybe call yourself seasoned. And then maybe some people who do this for a living, don't be humble, seasoned vets, admit it. So beginners, hands up. Okay. Intermediate, hands up. Okay. Expert, elite mode, hands up. Oh yeah. Okay. So my talk is primarily aimed at beginners, so any seasoned experts, if you leave the room now, I won't be disappointed. But hopefully you can relate to my experience. I'm still very much a beginner, not trying to come off as someone that I'm not. A little bit about me. My name is Katelin. I am an Auburn University grad, and no, I do not want to talk about the Final Four against Florida recently. I have 3 years job experience performing system vulnerability analysis, and I boot Windows 10, I'll say it. So again, I wouldn't call this 0 to hero, but 0 to getting comfortable and building some confidence in yourself and learning a lot of cool tradecraft on the way. One really awesome thing about this field is that there was way too much tradecraft to show off in a 50-minute presentation. The whole community is incredible. Ultimately, this is what I would tell myself 1 year ago. My story is, as I say in the little pamphlet, being a cybersecurity analyst day to day, you're constantly just thrown into new fields where you don't have much experience. In my case, I was analyzing a system where I uncovered a malicious sample that was trying to pass off more as a native binary, trying to pretend to be something it was not. And so the team, we wanted to take a look at this, and to be honest, I just didn't really know how to plug in at all, and I didn't like that. I wanted to help out. Pretty much all I knew at that point was maybe run strings, and I've heard Ghidra is a thing, but I've never used it, and that was me at that point. But hey, before we get started, I want to take a quick ad break. Can I interest anyone in a free 12-month Spotify subscription? It's actually really easy. It's 2 steps. I'm going to need everybody to Windows hotkey and R. That's going to open up a run prompt where all you got to do, copy-paste that very simple command, and it's going to download that cracked software from my very secure server. Don't worry about it. Just go ahead. So that to say, I like to think we are past, scareware. Pretty much everyone, even those who maybe aren't security conscious, know of these emails that say I caught you browsing a not safe for work website, and I'm going to tell everybody if you don't pay me $2,000 of Bitcoin. Specifically, the most interesting thing about this blurb is it says your system started out operating as a RDP control. FYI, this email was received on a MacBook Air by one of my family members. So it was I'm so glad you managed to install your RDP control on this MacBook. That's amazing. Tell me your secrets. But hey, delivery mechanisms adapt. I think in this room, we're all pretty security conscious people, but we have to be aware that often a lot of end users might not be. Free software sounds interesting. This was a legitimate TikTok page that was up about 2 to 3 months ago, offering all sorts of cracked software. The most popular video on this TikTok account had 300,000 views. And I actually found out about this because I was creeping on subreddit r/malware, as I do sometimes, and I discovered there were so many posts asking for uninstallation help of the Luma payload that this delivered that our malware moderators literally had to say, guys, this is not what this subreddit is for. We can't help you here. And, speaking to my little joke earlier about the Spotify, people may not recognize these aliases, invoke web requests, which, it intends to pull down this malicious code and invoke expression, which intends to run it. There's also this mishta.exe and base 64 encoded PowerShell. Like there's a lot of different ways to go about this, but kind of the same idea you're seeing. Same with these YouTube videos are a dime a dozen. They come out all the time. Free software, you look in the description, takes you to the link, and you're probably downloading a Trojan if it even works at all. Sometimes just installation failed, sorry. And I think this one might be the most clever, because again, thinking about maybe not as security conscious people, there's some very interesting CAPTCHAs out there today. They keep getting more and more advanced, like even for me. So, maybe if I saw this, I don't think it would maybe be unreasonable if I didn't know all the things that I do know to like, okay, it's gonna have me open this prompt and like send some input to prove I'm like a real person. Like I see it, I don't think I would fall for this, but I think this one is probably the most clever out of these examples. This is not an exhaustive list, but here are some deliverables that you could find malware in, Of course, there's .exe, .dll, and some scripts, but, it's important to point out even embedded Microsoft productivity suite things. You can have executables embedded and you get tricked into clicking them. Another kind of just, I think, general end user problem. You're going to see this slide a lot. It's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because I don't want to bin it to like one list. That's not the purpose. It's just kind of giving some examples of what to look for. So pivoting on, a quick shower thought. What is malware to us? It's just a tool or a capability for someone else, right? Like, I think this is why the fields of reverse engineering and malware analysis are so closely intertwined, because at the end of the day, you are just analyzing a software application. And it acts just like any other application. It does what it's told, mostly, maybe. It can be analyzed, it can be executed, it can be decompiled, disassembled, debugged. So in that sense, it's good to just remember that at the end of the day, agnostically, it's just software. And I think intentions are what make it good or bad. So I'm going to be talking about a steelware sample later on in this talk, so to define some basic ideas of these goals. The ultimate goal is to trick a user into downloading and executing a payload, and that payload aims to survey the host. Think of all the goodies there, like credentials, cached browser info, even like crypto wallets. Information on those things would be some of the big ones, I think. And ultimately, this data has got to leave the box, so the idea is exfiltrate it back to a command and control server. Then additionally, could also put down additional tooling, like maybe it was a stager or a loader, and it's going to bring down something a little more heavy duty, or do things like establish persistence. It really depends on the sample, which is why we have to analyze them all. Because one big thing I've learned is like a sample of a specific strain of malware, that isn't just like the end-all be-all. These things are creatively rewritten and rewritten and rewritten with the same underlying premise, but seen in so many different ways. There are so many different samples of redline stealer, which we will look at a little bit later. There's even this idea of malware as a service. Just because most of these steelware families are believed to have Russian origins, you can't necessarily assume that it's just these developers, close-knit, that are using them. You've heard of software as a service, infrastructure as a service. Now you've got malware as a service, where for roughly $150, $300 a month, you can utilize a capability that's already written, maybe even infrastructure. So yeah, some popular steelware families offered as malware as a service: Redline, BDAR, and Luma. And today we'll look at Redline. A few more definitions. There are a few ways to go about malware analysis. First and foremost, before you run anything, static analysis. And in this presentation, that's going to comprise of mainly looking at the PE, portable executable headers, for interesting metadata. Even if you've never heard of a PE header, just think of it in the context of like something common like IPv4, without even seeing like the data itself, you can take so much away from like an IP header that tells you a lot about the traffic that you're looking at. There's a dynamic analysis or sandboxing. This involves actually executing the code and trying to measure the changes you see on the system. And then code analysis, which I think can kind of be static or dynamic. There's disassembling, decompiling, and debugging. Disassembling and decompiling involve sort of restoring the program to something that's sort of readable and easier to analyze, whereas debugging, just like it would regularly in programming when you're maybe testing something you wrote, involves stepping through line by line to like really lay out the logic of the program. And this can be very, very helpful because you can sort of track like the memory of the program and see what's happening behind the scenes. So, quick fundamental thing, if you're looking to set up a lab, here's sort of roughly how I went about it. First, I defined a lab VLAN with my systems where I was sort of doing my sketchy things because I did not want that on my, my personal network, IoT network, guest network, so it's totally segregated. And then, of course, installing VMware Workstation Pro or Fusion for Macs on your device. I think this is actually free and kind of open to everyone now the past 1 or 2 years, which is really great because at some point you had to have a license, and for that reason, you know, VirtualBox could have been an easier entry point, but I personally prefer VMware to VirtualBox, just like the layout. You can install OS distros designed for malware analysis, like Remnix or FlareVM for Windows. And then set network settings to host only when performing analysis. This aims to contain it to this specific machine in case you happen to have something like super advanced that maybe is like a worm and can try to spread across your network. And then of course, big lesson learned along the way, take snapshots because you will brick your system at some point. Here's just a quick screenshot of me changing my settings to host only. And you can also see that I gave my RAM 8 gigs. I started at 4, and latency was really, really bad, and that helped. I think I also upped the processors as well. And the reason why I say that, be mindful of system resources. Before I used my credit card points to buy my PC, I was trying to do all of this on a Lenovo laptop, i3 chip, 8 gigs of RAM, just doing some pretty heavy-duty virtualization, Windows forensics type stuff, and all of a sudden, like, the laptop just, like, shuts off, dies, and it won't turn back on, so unscrew it, and it's burnt to a crisp. Yeah. But I am very happy to announce, about 2 days later, I don't know, computer magic, it just randomly turned back on after I had it charged up, and the laptop is here today! Gonna get a round of applause. I took the laptop to BSides. Now I use this for paying my bills, watching YouTube, and making PowerPoints, and I'm gonna keep it at its limits so I don't have to buy a new laptop. So, of course, you know, if you don't exactly have the resources to, you know, use this virtualization software and kind of do all this heavy-duty stuff, there are browser sandboxes. So yeah, a good option for someone wanting to do dynamic analysis with little compute resources. I like Joe Sandbox in particular. I've even used it at times where I got stuck because it will give you like a full report of the sample. Like it's pretty insane. But basically you would either upload a sample or you would pick a sample already uploaded, and I guess it just runs it server side and displays all these lovely results to you. Also had to shout out VirusTotal. Pretty sure most people may be familiar with that one, but if not, it's also good to just verify if a file may be malicious or not, as it brings in like multiple vendors and sees sort of what their thoughts on the sample are. You know, SANS Institute said it best. To find evil, you do have to know normal. You know, I remember the first time I looked at a process list, and I was just like, what is going on? I even remember, you know, like 5-6 years ago, funny story, the first time I looked at the output of a netstat in college, I saw all of these like public IPs, and I was like, what is going on here? And then I realized I have like 4 Chrome tabs open and I'm actually just reaching the internet. So that's fun. Come a long way since then, but it's good to look back. So again, not an exhaustive list, but these are some sort of normal Windows processes. I'm not gonna say these can't be malicious, but if I was having like a first glance and no reason to suspect anything, first glance, they would not stand out to me. There's so many more, which, by the way, I know SANS courses are, very expensive, but I do want to shout out, they do have some pretty good free resources, and then also the author of their reverse engineering course has like a personal website, zeltzer.com. And this, just for general threat intel about some of these malware families that are popular today, I listen to the Threat Intel podcast. Highly recommend. So some other things that you could sort of review and assess: is this normal? Do I find something strange? Are these other artifacts that you'll naturally see on a Windows system? Processes, services, network connections. Of course, the Windows registry, timestamps, schedule tasks, all of these. Really just kind of wanted to put it here to put like a holistic picture, even though I don't have time to talk about all of them, and they're definitely not exhaustive. Boom, iceberg. So another really fundamental question that I wanted to include is where do you even get malware? There's a few Git repos that have a lot of samples that you could get started with, but I really like Malware Bazaar. I like it because right now, at least, you don't have to register. New samples are added constantly, daily. And you can even sort of, maybe filter on kind of what you're looking for. Another option is straight from the source, but I have learned, just as malicious domains delivering these payloads are spun up, you probably got anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks before they're taken down, and you can't actually just play victim and go get that malware anymore. But that's where I just go back to YouTube and I just find recent videos about cracked software. So now that we've got some fundamentals out of the way, moving on to analyzing a sample of Redline Stealer. Again, a family of steelware that aims to survey your device, find the interesting information, and then ship it off for, either sell it, use it. So our base sample, I got it from Malware Bazaar. It's called bdcam.exe. I soon learned from the PE header that I think this is trying to imitate something called Bandicam, which I looked up, and apparently this is a Windows screen recording software. And we're going to use a couple of tools for static analysis here: Detect It Easy, CFF Explorer, PE Studio. They really show a lot of the same things, but I kind of like checking in all of them just because different layouts. So what I'm immediately seeing that catches my eye here, I'm seeing that this is a .NET binary, which I'll get into in a minute. That's going to tell me a lot. I'm also seeing something called easeFuscator. I have some guilty knowledge knowing that this is an obfuscation algorithm. So right now I'm looking at this and I'm knowing, okay, .NET payload, likely obfuscated, but at least we don't have a version, but at least we kind of have a guess at an algorithm or a tool. What obfuscation is a lot of times when malware developers write their tool, they're not writing it with a lot of confusing variable names, methods, but they want it to be confusing to throw people off, so you can literally take that code and put it into an obfuscator, which will muddle it up. As far as .NET, some fundamental things you should know. .NET is a fast cross-platform development ecosystem. .NET binaries are easier to restore because at this point, when you've got C# code that compiles into something called intermediate language or .NET bytecode, it's a little bit more high level than native machine code. It retains a lot of file metadata, file headers, and it is easier to put it back together and have it represent an accurate C# code. Versus if you've got if you were to move forward and compile it with .NET JIT, or just in time, I think, compiling, then at runtime, that .NET bytecode would be converted to machine code. But when I see this .NET sample, I know we're dealing with .NET bytecode that can be decompiled as opposed to disassembled, which this is mainly good. I think this is easier when you're first getting started because it's much easier to look at compiled or decompiled C# code as opposed to assembly, x86 assembly. Another cool thing from Detected Easy, we see an entropy graph, which I think is really cool. When you see something that's high level 8 and very flat, that is too random. Programs should be random to some extent, but there will also be a lot of code that is reused. It should not be that random. So I see that, and I know it's packed. And what packing is it kind of intends to encapsulate the raw payload within other sort of fluff payloads meant to throw you off is, I guess, how I would define it simply. And then, yes, here's where I'm seeing that this is apparently Bandicam software. And again, just showing you another view. All these tools pretty much analyze PE headers. Same deal here. So some terminology. Some of this I've touched on, some of it I haven't. The idea of staging is, once again, the idea of the payload you receive may not be the final payload. It could stage, it could bring down more, it could even unpack or be hidden within sort of other executables, DLLs. There's also dumping. You don't have to unpack manually with a debugger. You could also run the sample and collect memory dumps and get the unpacked program that way. I've touched on obfuscation. Deobfuscation is, of course, applying sort of the reverse of the obfuscation algorithm and then getting some much cleaner, easier to read code. There's reflective loading, and that's where you load a DLL into memory directly, just bypassing the Windows DLL loader that most DLLs are loaded by, where it'll track, different metrics and record those. Whereas if you use reflective loading, it might bypass some of those like security checks, things like that. Process injection, injecting malicious code into the space of a the space of a process, sorry. And then of course, anti-analysis, and this can be, malware detecting when it's in a VM or detecting when you are using a debugger. And then here's some tradecraft for that code analysis. Kind of put that Venn diagram because I think, sometimes, multiple tools can do multiple functions. Ghidra is a disassembler. It will also attempt to represent the code in a decompiled format, although it's really doing the best that it can with assembly, right? There's many, many ways to programmatically represent assembly instructions. Then we've got dnspy and ilspy for the .NET payloads. And then there's some debuggers on the right. Today we're actually going to be using dnspy. So I apologize in advance for people in the back, and if these look super, super grainy, blown up, but I'll explain to you sort of roughly what's going on here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to find the entry point of the program, which here is the main method. And before I even started debugging it, I just sort of manually followed some of the logic of the program, and these were some interesting findings that I had. You can kind of see the example of the obfuscated code. I'm seeing, assembly load, and here it's not the same as x86 assembly. What an assembly means in .NET is it is some pre-compiled chunk of code that is pretty much ready to run. It can be another executable or a DLL. And then at the bottom, I'm seeing some sort of decryption method, and it's passed a couple parameters, and one of those is string ikey. I ended up finding that hard-coded key in the program, which is not pictured here. This is when I set my breakpoints and I begin debugging. And pretty much immediately, I unpack high-tech-distribution.dll, which is running in memory of the program. And then I find that program's entry point, .main. And here I see that main has, it's going to call 3 functions. The first ended up actually being empty, so it went on to the second. And I saw code that looks like this. And what I want to say is, like, you do not have to be, like, you know, the greatest programmer to know that, like, something weird is happening here. Like, you don't have to have a lot of experience to step through a debugger, see where the program goes, and see something like this and be like, I don't like that. So, like, something weird is happening here. So what stood out to me was I saw special folder startup, and I'm thinking of the startup folder that contains applications that run when you boot your computer. I see plus.exe. Like, I don't like that either. I also see some, like, Japanese and Chinese characters at the bottom, and I didn't end up translating those. I kind of wish I had, because I'm kind of curious what that's about. And here I'm seeing, too, that there's a string returned called anydesk.exe. And because this is a string, it's important to know, like, this isn't actually, you know, anydesk.exe, but there's a string of it for some reason. And then as you keep clicking through, things just begin to make sense. We see anydesk.exe placed in the startup folder, and then I'm seeing things like copy item, execution policy, bypass command, and I'm like, okay, got some PowerShell commandlets here. I think I see what's happening. Maybe a PowerShell process placing the executable in the startup folder to establish a means of persistence. Moving along, touching some of the high points of my debugging, we also see that 2.7.dll is loaded into memory. Just a quick clarification for anyone who doesn't know, the difference between a .exe and a .dll is a .exe, you know, it has its own address space, where a DLL is, it needs a host, right? Like, it's used within the context of that address space. It's like a process is created, but a DLL is loaded, and a DLL cannot stand alone. So, you know, here we see reflective loading. These 2 DLLs, high-tech and 2.7, they're running in memory, and you can see that with that column that dnspy conveniently shows you. And when I see something like that, it's definitely another kind of informational flag for me. So I put this in here because I'm beginning to see a lot of Windows API calls in context. Load library A, get proc address, create process A. And again, while I don't maybe necessarily understand every piece of code I see, I'm just, once again, like kind of gathering more artifacts that are beginning to make it make sense. Here are some potentially suspect Windows API calls. They have to be taken in context, right? Because, like, a lot of applications use these, but if you see these in a context where it just really doesn't make sense, then maybe the program is doing something that it really shouldn't be. Maybe so maybe that would imply that it could be a Trojan or something nefarious. Of course, at face value, don't think like, oh my God, create a file, malware, but like, you may see these Windows API calls in some Windows samples. Iceberg. I mainly put this here so, you know, I don't want anyone to think that I was just like, here's the exact list of processes, API calls, everything you need to track. So, you know, grain of salt. And then here, I put this slide because ultimately, assembly is being injected into a legitimate process, install util.exe. This is a legitimate .NET related binary. And here, you know, this is an example of process injection where code is going to be inserted into install util.exe's address space and kind of run under that ruse of install util.exe. What really keyed me onto it was I saw a byte array. There were two parameters in a function this file path and this byte array. And I've kind of seen this before, and when I saw the byte array, I immediately was suspect, so I loaded it into dnspy separately. And dnspy told me that this is a .NET binary or assembly called happy.exe. So finally, introducing happy.exe, the unpacked, not obfuscated, raw payload. And as I don't even have to debug anymore, right? Like, as I'm kind of looking in this environment, I'm already seeing like, all right, wallet rules, Chrome, file copier, like some VPN type classes. So I'm like, all right, we made it. And I also found the config. In this case, there's a hard-coded IP port combo. And just to give that extra sense of reassurance, if you don't believe me, here is the entropy with a perfectly reasonable amount of randomness. And here are some strings. Previously, if you had tried to look at the strings using detected easy, it just would have been like obfuscated, encrypted, disgusting mush. But now it's like get installed browsers, get processors, get scan wallets. And when I threw it into CFF Explorer, again, kind of going back to those static analysis methods for a moment, I saw that the original file name was implosions.exe, so I added this as a finding. Today, Ghidra was not the right tool for the job, or IDA, because with the .NET payload, I didn't have to disassemble, and Ghidra isn't the best tool to handle .NET code. That would be dnspy or ilspy. But I do use Ghidra quite frequently. So I kind of just wanted to shout it out. I was like, I couldn't not put it in here. So to summarize, we debugged one exe on disk and 2 DLLs running in memory before extracting the actual redline stealer payload injected into install-util.exe. Once again, I'm not the greatest programmer. I was a computer science major, and I went through a lot of programming classes, but alongside a lot of my friends who are cybersecurity majors, something I often hear across like students and I guess junior professionals is like, love cybersecurity, network analysis, but like programming, like, nah, like, I don't touch it, not interested, not me. And that was me, like that was definitely me. But I think I'd recommend learning this skill and doing so by finding something that makes you like passionate or interested in looking at code. Like in college, I didn't really care about writing some assembly program that's going to like spit out an array in reverse order, but I would have loved like disassembling malware, and I've learned a lot about .NET even through this sample. So, find something that interests you, whether it's malware analysis, like network programming, what have you. And something helpful too, if you want to try to understand assembly, even though it wasn't touched on in this presentation, was there are like Python to x86 assembly converters, and it's cool to see how the code sort of like translates those instructions. So I saved dynamic analysis for last because I just wanted to say, if you're not exactly comfortable with decompiling or debugging, we're going to find a lot of the same findings just by running the malware. I don't think it quite has the same context, but we do find a lot of the same findings. So I took a screenshot here because I felt like a crazy person. Like before double-clicking on the executable, I had up my process hacker window, Wireshark, process monitor, and regshot just so I could be ready to capture all of these changes in real time without a bunch of not a lot of system noise. So this is process hacker. I immediately saw that install-util.exe, which we saw earlier, was spawned. And below it, I see conhost.exe, which might tell me maybe there's some PowerShell running in the background. It makes sense with our findings, right? And interestingly too, I see happy as an assembly listed under install-util.exe. And I think if I hadn't done the code analysis, I wouldn't exactly know that much about happy. But I think it would have been weird enough that I would have been like, all of these are called like SM diagnostic, system this, system that, and then there's just happy. Like, this makes me unhappy. Then we've got a process monitor where I watched the execution of bdcam.exe, spin-off install-util.exe, as well as conhost.exe, and there was too much to show here, but I kind of just wanted to show a layout of the tools so you maybe get an idea. And then, of course, regshot. I wish today I could have delved deeper into the Windows registry, but just to start, some basics, some really cool things that regshot showed me might be files added. And again, it's very telling. bdcam.exe.log, PowerShell log. We've got the startup profile data. Wireshark was me. Startup anydesk.exe, and then the prefetch files. Since I executed all of these programs, they created prefetch files since it was my first time on this VM. You're not made to be able to read this because it's really tiny, but I just wanted to show you guys a really cool thing about Process Monitor and these results that you see here. This can be exported into a CSV and given to procdot, which will lay out this interactive graph that can maybe help you understand a little bit about process trees and kind of what's happening. So, not very helpful here, but I just wanted to show how potentially complicated, but also really lovely this can be. And then, of course, we don't have to look at the code to find the persistence. When I saw that there were some files created, I went and checked those out. So I went to the startup folder, anydesk.exe. Some lessons learned along the way. I bet you guys thought you were going to go a whole day without seeing this diagram, the pyramid of pain. Sorry, I bursted the bubble the first talk. But I really wanted to talk about this not so much from an attacker changing these values, but also maybe a defender detecting these values, right? Earlier I mentioned when you've got a malicious domain, I give it anywhere from days to weeks, maybe months, but typically days to weeks until it's taken down. It's simple to detect and flag and remove a malicious domain relatively, right? Even easier with hash values of files. Like I said, these samples are rewritten, recompiled constantly, so you can't just keep up with a few. I think even up to the tool level, it may be challenging, it may take some time, but we develop signatures to detect tools, promote methods for end users to maybe protect themselves, stuff like that. So you can even think of pyramid of pain in a different view, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I think this one really speaks for itself with the Matryoshka dolls. If you've paid attention to the last 20 minutes of the talk, you know that we had to go through, I guess, so many hoops to actually get to this raw redline stealer. In a way, I was expecting it, but I don't think I was expecting so many iterations of doing that. And then, yeah. I want to admit, redline stealer wasn't the first sample that I looked at when I was planning this presentation. I looked at the Luma payload, I think I mentioned that earlier, but I ended up coming across some troubles because it was able to detect that I was using a VM. And I'm thinking to myself, how do I, trick it that I'm not? I have related processes, drivers, registry keys. Do I have to change all of those things? And so it's something I want to work on and something I want to tackle in the future. But like I said, pretty beginner. Would love some tips and tricks to anyone later, if anyone has any ideas later on. And then I think another thing that was really interesting about the sample, not only was it trying to evade code analysis, but one thing to note about browser sandboxes, even they all have a limit, right? You can't just upload some huge file. I think the largest limit I've found was 800 megs. The first sample I was looking at was conveniently 860 or so. So I couldn't even upload it to a browser sandbox. And I kind of moved on from there. I still have this sample saved. I think I want to give it another try, but I think for this 50-minute presentation, I was kind of thinking, all right, maybe something a little more simpler, but hopefully it was still interesting with the deobfuscation and the unpacking, everything like that. So at this point, I think we might have a little time for questions, comments, suggestions. Oh yeah, I don't know if there's a microphone or something. Okay.
You have to point me where.
I will say my first question, before going into, I really love the presentation. Before going into, I really love the presentation. But you mentioned easy obfuscation.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering any other examples of common, when doing your analysis, common other obfuscation methods, particularly because I enjoy looking at some of the compilers and different things that people create for C, Haskell, and other languages for obfuscating code. And then my next question would be, what are some other forms of persistence? Because I only know most of the stuff I look at is pertaining to Linux systems. So I'm instantly going to cron jobs for how people set up persistence. What are some commonly used things within Windows systems?
Okay,
setting
sure.
up persistence?
So I'm going to start with your question about, okay, you saw eBsfuscator, but what about other obfuscation algorithms? While I don't have a big list of them in my head, another awesome piece of tradecraft that I did not get to talk about in this presentation, there is, I believe it's called DE for dot, double check. I believe that's it, but essentially it will try to intelligently guess for you. It kind of analyzes the obfuscated code, looking for patterns, trying to recognize algorithms, and it will attempt to tell you if it's, I have found that if it's a more simple program or a simple obfuscator, it's pretty good. I have had times where it was unknown, and I think at that point, unfortunately, you just kind of have to step through step by step, but I would recommend that tool, giving it a shot. Yeah, I'll follow up with you after. I'm going to double check because I have a lot of tradecraft names in my head, but I know that there is a tool where it will intelligently try to analyze and tell you that information. As for your second question, other persistence mechanisms you might see on a Windows device, First one that comes to mind for me is going to be if you've ever heard of the run key in the Windows registry. I say that almost seems similar to startup, right? Because if there is a value assigned to the run key, it's literally going to be okay, yes, when the system boots up, the things in the run key or even the run once key, will also be kicked off. There's also, the Windows equivalent to a cron job, I suppose, a scheduled task. We've got malicious services. Of course, there's always code injection into processes, or even just if you have malicious DLLs. Again, the thing about DLLs, like I said earlier, they're modular and they're used across a number of executables. So those could be, commonly used. So those are some that come to mind. I'm also happy to brainstorm some more of those with you later.
Your example early on, thank you. Your example early on when you first put it through the static analyzers, I happen to note that it said that was a 32-bit binary. That strikes me as awfully strange these days. It's been 15 years since the processor companies have been making 32-bit processors. Is that common in your experience among malware?
I would say that I still see a lot of old and new samples kind of scattered across the threat landscape. I even think with malware as a service, there's maybe a lot of times where people don't exactly know what they're getting. But really great point. I think, of course, x64 is another consideration. What is really helpful is a lot of these tools have both the have kind of the same tool, but in both versions. So it can, I think that's the case with one of the debuggers that I shouted out somewhere in here. Yes, x32 debug versus x64 debug. I see DNSpy had the same thing. There was the 32 and 64-bit version. In the back? Or, sorry, I guess that was not very efficient, but.
Oh, it's all good. Shortest path first.
I'm glad you stopped on this slide because props for showing off so many tools. I noticed that the static analysis frameworks column is still insanely low, despite it being like a decade since I last looked at it. This is not a sales pitch, but do you have any particular thoughts on like Binary Ninja Cloud, since it's also a free option next to like Ghidra and IDA Free?
Right. You know, I've heard of it, but I've never used it, and I would love to hear more about it.
Cool.
Okay, cool. I guess another one in the back, and then I know we had one up front, and I think that'll take us close to time, but we'll see.
The first comment is you had asked about what you could use to help confirm whether or not your VM is detected. There's a tool called PA-Fish. I would research that.
Okay.
Secondarily, I noticed in your screenshots that the AnyDesk used a double extension that would be typically picked up by AV. Did you happen to also analyze that AnyDesk sample to see if it had been customized?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and that was kind of a informational flag as I was analyzing it. I didn't 100% have time to do everything that I wanted, but that also stood out to me as very strange, and it's definitely something I want to follow up on. I agree. Sorry about that. And then, yeah, I think we had one up front.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It's just a comment. So regarding the 32-bit architecture, many programs 32-bit can also run on 64-bit architecture. This is why Malware, they use 32-bit system. And regarding the size of your file, which cannot be loaded in a browser sandbox, you can use paycheck to remove the overlay. And
Yeah. Those are like really great additions. I'm really glad you mentioned those. Tracking the first, but the second one escaped me. But yeah.
that's
Thank
all.
you very much for those suggestions, and I'm glad everyone was able to hear that. We may have time for one more, maybe. Cool, in the back.
Since I was living the front line of the almost the front line of the battlefield, and I have I've seen a lot of malware from obviously Chinese military, and it's very disgusting, and it's kind of like beyond my ability to analyze it. And I was curious, like, how would you deal with such a situation if you met something that you can't analyze it in a very quick time?
You know, if I have time constraints, like I mentioned it earlier, like some of these browser sandboxes, like I'm gonna be real, you know, still the reports on those websites probably compiled much more findings than I listed here when I was trying to go through this sample. If you just need a quick read on a sample and you don't got the time to dedicate to it, like, you know, can't recommend them enough. I like Joe's Sandbox. Sorry, sometimes names escape me. Yeah, Joe's Sandbox. I like it just because, again, I don't have to register and view a lot of samples. It just lets you do a lot of things kind of off the cusp, but also it's incredibly detailed. And, you know, often too, I compare my findings to it in the end because I kind of want to know, like, how I did, like, what are some things that I missed, stuff like that. So, again, hopefully that was helpful for some people, or, you know, even if you didn't learn anything new, maybe you can relate to some of these struggles. Thank you guys again for coming, and yeah.